Recording started.
Hi Science 7 students. We're going to do a recording here to help prepare you for our first test in science. I really want to see you guys do well on it. So we're going to get started with this then. And so the first picture here we have is talking about adaptations. And I put adaptations help organisms to survive. And so we'll just read the definition for an adaptation. It's a body part or behavior that helps a living thing to survive. So let's have a look at this mantis here. This is a mantis here that's on a flower. And let's see how it shows adaptation to us. Well, it says here that the body shape and the color make the mantis look like part of the flower it lives on, so it can catch insects stopping by for nectar. So of course it's adapted in the color that it has, matching with the color of the flower. Okay, so we can see that when a creature is adapted to something, its body is somehow well suited to the environment somehow. Well, let's look at some other examples of creatures that are well suited to the environment. In other words, have adaptations. Well, for instance, fish are thin, they're really streamlined, and that helps them to swim better. And rabbits, we know, with wintertime coming up in the next little while, we see rabbits changing from brown fur to white fur, and that helps them to blend in better in the wintertime. So again, those two are examples of adaptations, which again are either body parts or behaviors that make a creature well suited to its environment, to the specific conditions that it has in its environment. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about ecosystems. So what are they again? Well, ecosystems are where living and non-living things hang out together. So that's the definition of an ecosystem. And we see an example of an ecosystem in this picture here. So ecosystems can be either large or small. So for an example, a pond could be an ecosystem, a forest could be an ecosystem, or even something like a little puddle of water, as small as it is, excuse me, that could be an ecosystem as well. Because again, remember the definition of an ecosystem, it's just a place where living things interact together with other living things and with non-living things. All right, so speaking of living things, remember that another name for that is biotic. Now, where does that name biotic come from? Well, we get that from the word bio. If we talk about biology, that's the study of living things. So biotic refers to any living thing. On the other hand, something that's abiotic is a non-living thing. Okay, so guys, we're going to go through some questions here. Throughout this recording, we're going to look at some blue questions. I'm just going to read them, and as I read them, please think to yourself what the answers would be, and then I'll go over the answers on the next page. Okay, so first of all, what's a definition of an adaptation? And then question 2, what are examples of biotic and abiotic things in the picture above? So I'll just let you have a little bit of a look at the picture for a while and see how many abiotic things you can find and how many biotic things you can find. We'll just take another moment and then we'll talk about the answers. Okay, going on to the next screen then. So the definition of an adaptation again is either a body part or behavior that helps a living thing to survive. And question number 2 said, what are examples of biotic and abiotic things in the picture? Okay, now I'm not going to tell you all the biotic things there were. There's probably some that you saw that I haven't seen. But for example, there was a bird, a person, and a fish. Now, as far as abiotic things or non-living, there was a tree, some grass, and some water. And there were a whole bunch of other abiotic things that I haven't even mentioned, which you probably found. Okay, so when we look at how living things are organized in ecosystems, they're organized into food chains and food webs. So here's an example of a food chain. And you can see that basically when we're talking about a food chain, it's a picture of who eats who in an ecosystem. Now remember, at the bottom of the chain, you get things like bacteria. Now, do you remember what the name is for things like bacteria? Those are decomposers. Something that decomposes something breaks it down. So they break down other members of the food chain after they become dead. And that's a really important part of any food chain, because what they do is they're going to break things down into soil, which again is going to provide a place for plants to grow, and it keeps the food chain going. Okay, so this is what they're going to look like, of course, a bunch of mud after bacteria breaks them down, along with the help of some other decomposers as well. All right, so let's look at the members of any food chain. Well, we start off with number 1 is the sun. That's the first member of the food chain. And why is it the first member? Well, without the sun, there's no energy for anyone to use. Because see, basically what's happening is as each member of the food chain is eating another member, they're getting the energy from the other member. It's being passed along. But the energy has to start somewhere, and it comes from the sun. Where does it go next? Well, we can see that number 2 is producers. Producers is a name for green plants. The reason we call them producers, they're the only organisms that can actually produce food using energy from the sun. They produce sugar. And that's during the process of photosynthesis. All right, so after plants, we go up to herbivores, such as deer. All right, so herbivores eat green plants. And then after herbivores, we get carnivores, which eat herbivores. Okay, so carnivores are animals such as wolves, which are going to eat herbivores such as deer. Okay, so those are some of the steps in the food chain. Now, what we don't have in this picture above is an example of an omnivore. So an omnivore is something that eats both plants and animals. And see if you can think of some examples of those. All right, so it's important to note that while the sun is a source of energy for any ecosystem, there are some organisms that don't need light in order to live. Okay, you've got some who are living in dark caves some places. So while the sun is an important part of the ecosystem you saw above, if you're looking at the requirements of one particular organism, there might be some creatures who don't need the sun, but other things such as food and water are considered essential for any organism. All right, so some questions here. Why are decomposers an important part of any ecosystem? Question 4, see if you can list some examples of decomposers that can be found in soil. Question 5, write the order that shows the steps in a food chain. So think back to the food chain. Remember, we're starting with the sun. And then where do we go from there? All right, question 6, why are plants called producers? That's 6A. And 6B, give an example of a producer found in a forest. I'm sorry guys, I just have to check my email and I'll be right back here. All right, so moving on guys, looking at the answers here. Why are decomposers an important part of any ecosystem? Well, they break down dead organisms to make soil. And then question 4, see if you can list 3 examples of decomposers that could be found in soil. Well, bacteria would be one, fungus, and of course worms are going to be found in soil, right? In question 5, write the order that shows the steps in a food chain starting with the sun. So you start with the sun, then of course producers, which are green plants, are going to store that energy from the sun. Herbivores like deer are going to eat producers, and then carnivores like wolves are going to eat herbivores. All right, question 6. Why are plants called producers? And I didn't write the answers here, but it's because they can produce food from the sun. Using energy from the sun, they can store that energy in the chemical energy of sugar. All right, B says, give an example of a producer found in a forest. Well, for example, a tree or a bush, right? Okay. So moving on, we see a pyramid here, and a pyramid shape helps us understand the relationship among food chain members. So how does it do that? Well, there's a few things we can see about this pyramid. First of all, we can see that the smallest organisms are at the bottom, and the largest organisms are at the top. Another thing we notice is that each time an organism eats an organism below it, so for instance, if a lion ate a wolf, Or, say if a bunny rabbit ate some grass, organisms always get less energy than was stored in the creature below it, because some of it's wasted. They don't eat all of it, for instance. Okay? So what happens is only about 10% of the energy that was stored in the organism in the level below is going to be given to the organism in the level above that eats it. So 90% of the energy is going to be wasted. So here's what happens. Let's say that the grass has 100 units of energy. Well, since the next creature, the bunny rabbit, is only going to get 10% of that energy, it's only going to get 10 units of energy. And since the next creature that eats the bunny rabbit, the wolf, is only going to get 10% of its energy, it's only going to get 1 unit of energy. Okay, so each time 10% is the amount of energy that the creature gets from the energy it eats, or from the organism it eats, I should say. But you can see that it actually gets less and less energy as you move along, because we're taking 10% of a smaller and smaller amount. Okay, so that's one problem, you could say, as you move up a food chain. But there's another problem as you move up a food chain. Poisons become more concentrated. And the reason is that if, say, there was some poison in the soil, well, bunny rabbits would eat lots of grass, but then wolves would eat lots of bunnies. So as you move up, there's more and more poison that gets into the higher levels of the food chain. So again, poisons become more concentrated as you move up to the highest level. All right, so we looked at food chains, but if you have many food chains linked together, they form a food web. And so, for example, a food chain would be something like this here. You know, these insects get eaten by these birds, which get eaten by foxes. That's a food chain, but that food chain is connected to other food chains, and the whole thing becomes a web. All right, so some more questions here. Compare the size of organisms at the top of a food chain to those at the bottom. Question 8. How much energy does an organism in a food chain get by eating the organism below it in the chain? And what percent was that? Question 9. What's the pattern in the food chain in terms of how much energy organisms get as you move up the chain? And question 10, what's another problem we saw that occurs as you move up a food chain? Okay, so comparing the size of the organisms in a food chain, at the bottom of the food chain we see small organisms, such as bunny rabbits, and at the top of the chain we see large organisms. Question 8, how much energy does an organism in a food chain get by eating the organism below it in the chain? It gets 10% of the energy from the organism eaten, and 90% is wasted. Question 9. What's the pattern in a food chain in terms of how much energy organisms get as you move up the chain? Well, again, you can see here that they get less and less energy as you move up a chain. In question 10, what's another problem you have as you move up the chain? Well, poisons become more concentrated as you move up the chain. Good stuff. All right, so now we're going to talk about photosynthesis. It's that big word. So photosynthesis stores energy in sugar, but cellular respiration uses energy from sugar. Okay, so let's focus on this leaf that has to do with photosynthesis. Well, photosynthesis is used by plants to take energy from the sun and to store this energy in the form of glucose, or sugar. So let's look at the reaction that shows this. Okay, we get the sun's energy combined with water and carbon dioxide, and that's used to produce both glucose and oxygen. Now remember that photosynthesis only happens in green plants. And why is it that green plants are green? You ever wondered that before? Well, they have this pigment in them that's called chlorophyll, and so chlorophyll gives green plants their color. Okay, let's check out a few questions based on what we've just gone over. What two things are produced by the process of photosynthesis? So in the equation above, those are products. Things that are produced by something are products. You can see in the equation that glucose, or sugar, or food, is one thing, and the second thing is oxygen. Okay, why are plants green? Well, again, that's because of chlorophyll. That's the pigment that makes them green. Good stuff. So, moving along. Okay, here's where we actually discuss the answers. So we'll move on. Now, cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. How is it the opposite? Okay, here's photosynthesis. And remember how photosynthesis produced those two things, glucose and oxygen? Well, cellular respiration uses up those two things. So it's basically the same equation. If you look at this equation and you turn it backwards, that's pretty much the equation for cellular respiration. But what else do you notice is similar in both equations? Well, we know that photosynthesis uses up energy, the sun's energy, or solar energy, but cellular respiration produces energy. So cellular respiration does the same thing that a car does. A car uses gasoline to produce energy, and that's the fuel for a car. But what a cell does is it uses glucose or sugar as a fuel, and it burns it to get energy from it. Okay, so again, the purpose of cellular respiration is to produce energy from sugar. All right, so some questions here. Two things were produced in photosynthesis and used up in cellular respiration, the same two things. What were they? Question 14, explain how a cell is like a car in terms of how it gets energy from fuel